In the cold, hyper-sanitized underbelly of Deep Space Transit Hub Aion-7, there were 3 absolute rules: keep your security badge visible, nod respectfully at species whose titles outweighed your annual paycheck, and never, under any circumstances, step into noble business. Caleb Walker had broken all 3 before his lunch clock even started ticking. Caleb was an oil-stained, 32-year-old maintenance technician from the rain-soaked outskirts of Eugene, Oregon. He wasn't a galactic war hero. He wasn't an elite diplomat. He was a guy holding a rusted torque wrench in one grease-smudged hand and a lukewarm cup of synthetic station coffee in the other. His shift had begun long before Earth Standard Time's arbitrary sunrise, and his body felt every single hour of it. Standing near a wheezing, malfunction-prone beverage dispenser in the station's massive central cafeteria, Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The cafeteria was a gleaming cathedral of crystal archways, glowing neon banners, and high-altitude dining platforms. Around him, the children of the galaxy's wealthiest planetary dynasties sat in pristine, silver-embroidered uniforms. They gossiped, laughed with engineered perfection, and threw away meals that cost more than a month of Caleb's rent. And then, Caleb saw her. She sat at the far end of the hall, tucked into a shadows-draped alcove beneath a flickering fluorescent light. She was tiny, barely reaching Caleb's shoulder, with soft, silver-blue skin, amber eyes that seemed far too heavy for a child, and hair that glowed with a faint, violet sheen. On her table sat a standardized station tray containing 3 pale, gelatinous nutrient cubes. She hadn't touched a single bite. Her small, thin hands were tightly folded in her lap, her head bowed so low it looked like she was trying to apologize to the universe for taking up physical space. No one looked at her. The tall, silver-robed alien instructors walking past the tables conveniently glanced in the opposite direction. The floating station surveillance monitors hovered right past her without stopping. Dozens of upper-crust alien students sneered as they walked by, whispering cruel slurs in high-frequency dialects. "I have not eaten since yesterday," she whispered to herself, her voice barely a breath. Nobody moved. Nobody cared. Caleb stood by his broken machine, his wrench heavy in his grip. His own lunch was pathetic, half a chicken sandwich wrapped in crinkled wax paper, a bruised gala apple, and a stolen packet of yellow mustard he'd swiped from the human commissary. It wasn't much, but it was his. Every instinct in Caleb's head shouted at him to turn around. Stay in your lane, Walker. On a multi-species trade station, stepping in meant risking your work permit. It meant getting flagged by station security, handed a formal disciplinary strike, and put on the first cargo shuttle back to Earth with a massive debt collector waiting at the spaceport. But when Caleb looked at her bowed head, he didn't see an alien. He saw his little sister, Maya, 20 years ago back in Oregon, sitting on the damp concrete curb outside her elementary school, clutching her backpack tightly because their dad had forgotten to pick her up again. He remembered that look, acting brave because being humiliated hurt a hell of a lot worse than being scared. Caleb let out a slow, heavy breath, shoved his torque wrench into his tool belt, and picked up his wax paper package. He walked past 2 high-ranking alien diplomats, stepped straight into the noble dining zone, and pulled out the metallic chair directly across from the little girl. Conversations abruptly died nearby. Jeweled heads turned in shock. A low, offended murmur swept through the surrounding tables like a wave. The girl flinched, her amber eyes snapping up in sheer terror. I am not permitted to sit with registered dynasty families, she stammered instantly, her hands trembling as if warning him to flee before he brought disaster down on his head. Caleb casually unwrapped his wax paper, revealing the cut sandwich. Good thing I'm not a registered family. She blinked, confused by the strange human phrase. You are human. Most days, yeah, Caleb muttered. He pulled out a plastic knife from his pocket, cleanly sliced the chicken sandwich in 2, and pushed the larger half across the table toward her. Chicken and wheat bread. Nothing fancy. It won't glow, it won't scream, and it definitely won't try to negotiate a trade treaty with you. The girl stared at the bread as if it were a high-grade explosive. Around them, the cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air recyclers. "You do not know my house name. Do I need it to split your meal?" Caleb shrugged, picking up his own half and taking a large bite to prove it wasn't poisoned. "You're hungry. I've got food. Where I come from, you don't need a birth certificate to sit at a table." She reached out, touching the crust with the absolute tips of her fingers. As if terrified it would vanish if she dared to believe it was real. "People always ask for names first. They ask a lot of things. People ask a lot of dumb things," Caleb corrected around a mouthful of chicken. "I'm Caleb Walker. Maintenance Logistics. Originally from Oregon. I fix broken drink machines, unclog environmental air scrubbers, and disappoint my mother by not calling home enough on Sundays." The girl held the sandwich with both hands, bringing it close to her chest. A tiny, fragile spark lit up her eyes. "Leora," she murmured quietly. "Just Leora." "Nice to meet you, just Leora," Caleb smiled softly. For the first time in what looked like months, the little girl smiled back, a small, hesitant, beautiful thing. Neither of them noticed the microscopic, jet-black surveillance drone hovering 30 feet above them near the ceiling architecture. Its silent, ultra-high-definition optical lens adjusted, locking onto Caleb's face, his grease-stained name tag. And the exact moment a low-level human technician shared his lunch with the most guarded secret in the galaxy. When you give a starving kid half a sandwich on a space station, you don't expect it to change your daily routine. But by noon the next day, Caleb Walker realized that kindness on Aion-7 was a dangerous habit, one that drew eyes you really didn't want looking at you. The next morning, Caleb tried to convince himself that yesterday had been a one-time lapse in judgment. Stations were weird places. You hold an elevator door for someone, and suddenly they think you're declaring a blood feud or accidentally proposing a commercial alliance. So, when his 12 p.m. break rolled around, Caleb grabbed his standard-issue cafeteria tray, tucked his head down, and tried to walk past the upper-level dining quarter without making eye contact. He failed before he even reached the hydration station. Leora was sitting in the exact same corner, hidden partially behind a wide, potted low-gravity moonfern. She had a fresh, untouched station tray sitting in front of her. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, but her eyes were glued to the main entranceway. The moment Caleb walked through the heavy pneumatic doors, her shoulders dropped, and a look of profound relief washed across her face, so fast and raw she couldn't hide it. Caleb stopped in his tracks, looked down at the turkey sandwich in his hand, and sighed. "You know," Caleb said, walking over and sliding into the chair across from her, "if this becomes an everyday arrangement, I'm going to need you to start filling out food review cards." Leora looked up, her amber eyes widening. I do not know how to rate human food." "It's easy," Caleb said, setting half his sandwich on a clean paper napkin in front of her. 10 out of 10 means your grandmother would approve. 1 out of 10 means it came out of that machine over there." He pointed his thumb toward the beverage dispenser he had spent 2 hours servicing yesterday. Right on cue, the machine made a sickening mechanical gurgle, shuddered violently, and dropped a paper cup sideways onto the metal deck, spilling fake orange juice everywhere. "That," Caleb stated solemnly, "is a solid one." Leora slammed both her hands over her mouth, but a sudden, high-pitched giggle escaped her chest anyway. It was light, loud, and completely unreserved. A few noble alien students at nearby tables snapped their heads around, glaring at her as if laughing in public violated station municipal code. Caleb ignored them entirely. He unwrapped his food and took a bite. "So, just Leora, where's home for you?" Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a defensive caution. "Far away." "That is a terrible answer," Caleb said plainly. "It is the safest one," she replied softly. Caleb stopped chewing. Back in the Pacific Northwest, when someone gave you an answer like that, you didn't press. You let the silence sit until the other person felt ready to fill it. Fair enough, Caleb nodded. I'm from a place where it rains 9 months out of the year, and everybody acts like going hiking is a legitimate personality trait. Leora observed him with intense curiosity. Her silver blue ears twitching slightly. Do you miss it? Mostly when the station's air recyclers start making everything smell like burnt plastic, Caleb admitted with a grin. Why did you leave your home world? She asked, taking a small, tentative bite of the turkey sandwich. The real answer was heavy, stacked up medical bills from his mother's chemotherapy, predatory high-interest credit lines, and a labor market back on Earth that offered zero upward mobility unless you knew someone in high orbital command. But she was just a kid. She didn't need the weight of adult economic misery resting on her shoulders. Earth is beautiful, Caleb said gently, but beauty doesn't pay rent. Leora nodded slowly, as if that made far more logical sense than it should have for an 11-year-old. I was sent here to learn about how people operate. Rough assignment, Caleb chuckled. How's the class going? They do not like me, she said flatly. She wasn't fishing for sympathy, she was simply stating a tactical fact. Caleb looked across the wide expanse of the cafeteria. The noble students sat in tightly packed clusters of immaculate gray and gold uniforms. Their postures were stiff, their voices pitched low and cold. None of them looked happy, but none of them looked isolated either. Maybe they just don't know you yet, Caleb offered. They know enough, Leora replied, staring down at her napkin. I have no house banner here. No diplomatic escort. No formal titles. No one important claims my name. Caleb took another bite of his lunch, chewed thoughtfully, and then pointed his sandwich half directly at her nose. Back in Oregon, if a kid showed up alone at the lunch table, the decent thing to do was make room. And if the rest of the room didn't like it, well, they could go eat in the hallway. Leora stared at him, stunned. Humans speak as if institutional rules are completely optional. Nah, Caleb smirked. We just argue with the stupid ones. Leora burst out laughing again, a genuine, beautiful sound that rang out across the quiet hall. High above them, mounted near an air intake grate, the tiny black drone shifted its position soundlessly, its thermal sensors tracking the rise in Leora's body temperature and her elevated heart rate. Caleb glanced up at the ceiling, eyeing the machine for 2 lingering seconds. He knew station equipment inside and out, and that thing was far too advanced to belong to municipal security. Leora noticed his gaze. Her posture instantly stiffened. Does it bother you being monitored? Caleb looked back down at her, a little girl with no house name, sitting in a room full of arrogant aristocrats who thought nobility was measured in genetic lineage. Only when I'm doing something wrong, Caleb said softly. And right now, I'm just enjoying my lunch break. Before Leora could respond, a shadow fell across their table. Caleb set his coffee cup down with agonizing slowness. I take it, he murmured, this guy isn't one of your school friends. Arrogance on a space station usually came wrapped in expensive silk, backed by private security. And completely devoid of common sense. Lord Malrek of House Thorne possessed all three in overwhelming quantities. Lord Malrek crossed the polished floor of the cafeteria as if the station's structural steel had been forged exclusively for his feet. He was tall, lithe, with pale alabaster skin and eyes like cold mercury. His pearl-gray academic uniform was trimmed with real gold thread, the kind of attire that made a casual lunch look like a hostile corporate takeover. 2 broad-shouldered student enforcers trailed closely behind his left and right shoulders, their arms crossed, faces set in practiced sneers. Malrek was accustomed to a specific reaction when he entered a room, lowered eyes, nervous adjustments of posture, and a quiet, respectful panic. He expected the room to remember that his father controlled the deep space trade corridors for 3 entire star sectors. Caleb Walker gave him none of it. Caleb sat back in his cheap plastic chair, his grease-stained work shirt unbuttoned at the collar, resting one elbow on the table. He looked up at Malrek with the tired, unbothered expression of an American blue-collar worker whose break time was being foolishly interrupted by someone who had never held a screwdriver in his life. Malrek stopped at the edge of the table, looking down at the half-eaten turkey sandwich in Leora's hands. "How touching," Malrek purred, his vocal translator smoothing his voice into a dangerous, velvet purr. "The nameless stray has found a primitive mammal to feed her scraps." Leora's fingers tightened so hard around her paper napkin that the material tore. Her shoulders hunched inward, trying to shrink into the wall. Caleb didn't jump up. He didn't slam his fists on the table. He calmly picked up his napkin, wiped a small dab of mustard off his thumb, and looked straight into Malrek's mercury eyes. "She was hungry," Caleb said flatly. Malrek's lips curled into a razor-thin smile. "Was she? Then perhaps station management should place a shallow feeding bowl for her near the service entrance. Along with the rest of the pest population." One of the enforcers behind Malrek let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. Caleb felt a familiar, hot flare igniting in his chest, the same spark he used to feel in high school when some varsity athlete backed a freshman against a locker. But Caleb wasn't a teenager anymore. He had an employee ID number. He had a family relying on his monthly wire transfers. So he kept his tone as level as concrete. "That was a whole lot of expensive words just to tell me your parents never taught you basic manners." The surrounding cafeteria went deathly quiet. The hum of the environmental scrubbers seemed to drop an octave. Even the broken drink dispenser stopped its rhythmic dripping. Malrek's smile vanished instantly. His pale eyes narrowed into slits. "Do you have any comprehension of who I am, human?" "Nope," Caleb said, reaching out to grab his coffee. "But I'm starting to get the general idea." A few alien students at nearby tables quickly turned their heads away, terrified that merely witnessing Malrek's embarrassment would mark them for retaliation. Malrek took a step closer, leaning down until his shadow completely engulfed Caleb's tray. "I am Lord Malrek of House Thorne. My family commands the fleet assets that keep this sector from collapsing into piracy. My father sits on the Imperial Advisory Circle. You fix plumbing. Technically, beverage dispensers and air filtration systems," Caleb corrected smoothly. "You think this is funny?" "No," Caleb replied, his voice dropping all humor. "I think it's my lunch break, and you're standing in my light." The statement hit Malrek like a physical slap. He didn't want a logical exchange, he wanted submission. He wanted this human maintenance worker to tremble, to realize the immense hierarchy of blood and wealth that governed the galaxy. Instead, Caleb was treating him like an annoying brat throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. Defeated by Caleb's unyielding apathy, Malrek snapped his glare toward Leora. "And as for you," Malrek spat, his voice laced with pure venom. "You hide in the shadows, pretending your silence is dignity. Everyone on this station knows what your silence really means. It means you are trash. No house claims you. No banner protects you." Leora's head bowed lower. The words hit her like physical strikes, opening a deep, pre-existing wound. Caleb quietly took the remaining slice of bruised apple from his tray and slid it across the table, placing it directly over Leora's trembling hand. "Eat," Caleb said softly to her. Malrek glared at the apple, then back at Caleb. "Do humans often feed stray animals?" Caleb held Malrek's gaze for 3 excruciating seconds. The silence between them stretched thin as razor wire. "Only when everybody else forgets how to be human," Caleb said. For a brief instant, Malrek's composure cracked entirely. His jaw clenched tightly, his pale skin flushing with angry crimson. His enforcers stopped chuckling, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Above them, the tiny black surveillance drone drifted lower by 6 inches, its internal mechanism making a tiny click-clack sound as its optical tracking system recalibrated. Malrek caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. His brow furrowed in sudden suspicion. He looked at the high-tech drone, then down at Leora's pale face. "Interesting," Malrek murmured, his tone shifting from malicious to coldly calculating. "The girl without a name has a high-tier watcher hovering over her." Caleb didn't like the tone. He didn't like the way Malrek's eyes lingered on the machine. Malrek stepped back, smoothing down the front of his pearl-gray tunic. "Enjoy your meal, human. Enjoy it very much. You may have just bought more trouble than your meager paycheck can afford." With a sharp turn on his heel, Malrek walked away, his 2 shadows trailing after him. Only when their footsteps faded completely did Leora let out a long, shuddering breath. Caleb pushed his lukewarm coffee aside and looked across the table. "You okay, kid?" She gave a small, jerky nod, the kind kids give when they've already decided that complaining won't change anything. "You should not have answered him," she whispered. "He will not forget this." "Yeah," Caleb said, watching Malrek return to his table and whisper furiously to his inner circle while staring directly at the floating drone. "I got that impression." Leora looked down at the apple slice. "Why did you do it, Caleb?" Caleb picked up his heavy torque wrench from the spare chair and stood as his brake timer buzzed on his wrist. "Because he was being an arrogant jerk, Leora. Where I come from, not every fight is worth starting. But some things are worth not walking away from. When powerful people realize they can't intimidate you with words, they stop talking and start looking for a dark corridor without surveillance cameras." For the next 4 days, Caleb Walker attempted to retreat into his normal, invisible routine. On Aion-7, normal meant ignoring the fact that the environmental scrubbers rattled like old tin cans, pretending the cargo elevators weren't hanging by fraying gravity cables. And ignoring the murderous glares Lord Malrek threw at him every time they crossed paths in the main concourse. He failed on all accounts. Leora had become a permanent fixture during his midday break. She never asked to join him, she simply materialized near his table with that quiet, careful grace typical of children who expect to be shooed away. Caleb adaptively expanded his lunch prep. He brought an extra apple, a couple of protein bars, and eventually a small jar of creamy peanut butter from the human supply quarter. Leora had approached the peanut butter with academic gravity. "It adheres to the superior roof of the oral cavity," she observed after taking a small bite from a cracker. "That's part of the authentic American experience," Caleb informed her solemnly. "Why would your species engineer a food product that actively resists consumption? We also invented income taxes, leaf blowers, and reality television," Caleb countered. "Nobody ever accused humanity of being sensible." She laughed easily now. The terrifying, watchful look in her amber eyes was slowly dissolving. But she still looked over her shoulder whenever a shadow crossed the table. On Friday morning, Caleb was assigned to a routine maintenance task in the lower environmental ring, a damp, cavernous maze of high-pressure water pipes and humongous air purification units. To his surprise, Leora had followed him down, keeping a respectful 10-foot distance while he lay flat on his back beneath a massive environmental control panel. His jaw clenched around an LED flashlight. "Are human societal laws written down?" she asked, her voice echoing in the metallic hallway. Caleb pulled the flashlight from his teeth and wiped his grease-stained forehead. "Some of them. The big ones, the real important ones, usually get taught around kitchen tables." "What does that mean?" "It means, don't hit people smaller than you," Caleb said, turning a heavy iron valve with his wrench until a high-pressure leak hissed to a stop. "Don't take the last slice of pizza unless everyone's had a turn. Say, thank you, when somebody pulls you out of a ditch. Hold the door if somebody's hands are full. Call your mother." Leora processed this information as if he were reading ancient sacred scripture. "That is all." That's more than enough to keep most folks busy for a lifetime, Caleb grunted, sliding out from under the machinery. Leora crouched beside the console, careful not to let her robes touch the oily deck floor. In the noble houses, the very first rule taught to children is, know who matters. Caleb sat up, resting his elbows on his knees. Sounds exhausting. It is safe, she murmured softly. Safe and right aren't always the same thing, kid. Silence settled over the maintenance bay, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the station's core engines. High above them, hovering near a yellow hazard sign, the black drone floated silently, its optical lens tracking their interaction. Caleb glanced at the machine, then back at her. That drone. It belongs to you, doesn't it? Leora's expression clamped shut so fast it was an answer in itself. I am not permitted to declare its ownership. That's a yes wrapped in corporate bureaucracy, Caleb noted. Is it dangerous? No. Then why hide it? Because, Leora whispered, staring down at her boots, if you truly knew who I was, you would act differently. Everyone does. Caleb packed his tools into his canvas bag with deliberate slowness. Probably. I'm notoriously awkward around rich folks. I am serious, Caleb, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What if I am dangerous? What if staying near me brings trouble? Caleb looked down the long, dimly lit maintenance corridor. He thought about the rain in Eugene, the quiet desperation of working-class survival, and his little sister waiting alone on a cold curb. Then you're the most polite trouble I've ever run into, Caleb smiled gently. I think I can handle it. 3 hours later, Lord Malrek decided Caleb Walker had been comfortable for far too long. Caleb was pushing a heavy utility cart loaded with industrial air filters down the isolated service corridor behind the West Academic Wing. His left shoulder throbbed from hauling heavy gear all morning, his stomach was growling, and his only goal was to finish this run, meet Leora in the cafeteria, and share a packet of peanut butter. Suddenly, his maintenance tablet chirped violently with a red alert notice, Auxiliary Airlock 07, Pressure Flute Variance. Caleb frowned. Airlock warnings were never routine. But as he tapped the screen to run a secondary diagnostic, the alert vanished instantly. Someone had manually overridden the system from an administrative console. What the hell? Caleb muttered. He shoved his utility cart aside and jogged down the narrow, dimly lit service corridor toward Airlock 07. As he turned the corner, he spotted Lord Malrek and his 2 heavy enforcers walking calmly away from the restricted airlock bay. Their pearl-gray uniforms were immaculate, their faces set in cold, rehearsed indifference. Malrek stopped when he saw Caleb, a sickeningly polite smile spreading across his face. Lost again, maintenance human. Caleb kept his hand firmly on his heavy torque wrench. I've got an environmental alert pinging from this section. This section is currently reserved for private academic exercises, Malrek said smoothly. Stepping directly into the center of the narrow hallway to block Caleb's path. Return to your garbage collection. My tablet says otherwise, Caleb growled. Your tablet, Malrek purred, says whatever my family's security override permits it to say. Caleb pushed past Malrek's shoulder, and stopped dead in his tracks. Through the reinforced, triple-pane quartz window of Auxiliary Airlock 07, he saw a small, silver-blue hand pressed feebly against the glass. Leora was inside the airlock chamber. The internal environmental lights had been manually shifted to a harsh, blinding blue, the setting used for cold storage preservation. Frost was already creeping across the inside of the thick glass, crystallizing around her tiny body. Her chest was heaving, her breathing shallow as the chamber's temperature rapidly plummeted below freezing. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't pounding on the door. She was simply huddled against the cold metal bulkhead, shivering violently, trying with all her remaining strength not to cause a scene. Caleb's blood ran colder than the airlock chamber. She needed a practical lesson in humility, Malrek whispered behind him, his tone dripping with casual sadistic pleasure. To remember her proper place in the galactic order. Caleb slowly turned around. The exhaustion in his muscles vanished, replaced by a terrible, terrifying stillness. "Get out of my way," Caleb said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a flat line of pure, lethal intent. There is a specific moment when a working man stops caring about his job, his future, or his personal safety. For Caleb Walker, that moment arrived when he saw frost forming on an 11-year-old girl's eyelashes. Lord Malrek didn't move. He stood his ground in the center of the narrow service corridor, his arms folded neatly behind his back, flanked by his two broad-shouldered enforcers. "You have zero security authorization to access that environmental lock, human," Malrek said, his tone dripping with condescending authority. "If you touch that control panel, I will personally see that you are charged with high sabotage against noble property." Caleb didn't bother arguing. He reached down into his canvas tool bag, gripped the solid steel handle of his 18-inch industrial manual override wrench, and stepped forward. "I don't need authorization," Caleb growled. "I have tools." One of the enforcers stepped up, raising a shock baton, but Caleb didn't even look at him. He shoved past the alien youth with such raw, explosive momentum that the enforcer stumbled backward into the metallic bulkhead with a loud clang. Caleb dropped to his knees in front of Airlock 07's digital control interface. The main touchscreen was flashing a red administrative lock, "Access denied, House Thorne override." "Spell my name right on the incident report," Caleb muttered. He jammed the flat end of his steel wrench straight into the seam of the plastic casing, twisted with all his weight, and ripped the front control panel completely off the wall. Sparks showered over his hands, burning small black holes into his work shirt. He grabbed a bundle of optical data cables inside, yanked them free, and jammed the steel wrench directly into the primary mechanical gear release. "Security has been alerted." Malrek barked from behind, his voice finally losing its calm composure. "You are destroying station infrastructure." "Good." Caleb roared, putting his full body weight against the wrench. "Maybe when they get here, they can explain why a kid is freezing to death in a maintenance closet." Clack chunk. The heavy pneumatic locking pins inside the airlock door slammed backward. A dense cloud of sub-zero fog poured out from the seal, rolling over Caleb's work boots like dry ice. Caleb dragged the heavy steel door open. Leora was curled into a tight ball on the frost-covered deck, her skin turned a deep, unhealthy shade of purple, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her small fingers were locked tightly around her collar, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. When she looked up and saw Caleb through the fog, her amber eyes filled with desperate, overwhelming terror, not for herself, but for him. I did not touch the controls, Caleb," she whimpered, her voice cracking. I tried not to make trouble." "Shut up, kid," Caleb said softly, his own hands shaking as he stripped off his heavy thermal work jacket and wrapped it tightly around her tiny frame. "You're done waiting." He lifted her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird made of hollow glass. He pulled her close against his chest, using his own body heat to fight off the deadly chill creeping through her core. Heavy, rhythmic boot heels slammed against the deck floor as 5 station security officers rounded the corner, their pulse rifles raised, uniforms spotless, LED lights flashing red. Lord Malrek instantly stepped in front of the guards, his hands held out in a theatrical gesture of outraged innocence. "Captain!" Malrek called out loudly, his voice echoing in the hallway. "Thank the heavens you arrived." This human maintenance worker went completely mad. He vandalized the auxiliary airlock, bypassed administrative protocols, and assaulted noble students. The security captain, a tall, avian alien with sharp, hawk-like features, didn't even look at the frost melting inside the airlock chamber. He didn't look at the small blue girl trembling in Caleb's jacket. His weapon remained leveled straight at Caleb's chest. "Technician Walker," the captain commanded coldly. "Set the miner down immediately and place your hands behind your head." Caleb pulled Leora tighter against his chest. His burned fingers throbbed with intense pain, his shirt was scorched, and his lungs burned from inhaling cold chemical exhaust. He looked at the captain, then at the shattered panel, then straight into Malrek's smirking face. She was turning blue in a locked freezer, Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. And not one of you bastards cared. Above them, mounted high on the ceiling architecture, the microscopic black surveillance drone slowly descended. Its high-resolution optical lens zoomed in close, recording the raw, blistered burns on Caleb's hands, the terrified tears in Leora's eyes, and the spotless, triumphant smile on Lord Malrek's face. 10 minutes later, Caleb Walker learned the fundamental truth of Deep Space Station Aion-7, saving a child's life could get you thrown in chains faster than murder. Provided the paperwork was signed by the right family. They didn't use iron handcuffs. They used a humming, pale blue energy restraint field that bound Caleb's wrists behind his back. Every time he shifted his weight, the field discharged a tiny, stinging electrical pulse through his forearms, a polite, corporate reminder of his complete powerlessness. He stood in the center of the high administrative review chamber, a massive, circular amphitheater suspended high above the station's executive sector. Floating, anti-gravity seats held dozens of station directors, regional trade representatives, and legal advocates, all looking down at him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. At the center podium stood Lord Malrek, accompanied by a senior legal advocate draped in immaculate midnight blue silks. The situation is regrettably straightforward, directors, the legal advocate proclaimed, his voice amplified across the chamber's audio grid. The human technician, Caleb Walker, suffered a severe emotional break. He misinterpreted a routine, internal disciplinary exercise conducted by House Thorne, damaged high-grade municipal environmental property, and physically seized an unregistered minor without legal custody. Caleb stood under the glaring white spotlights, his boots dirty, his work pants covered in grease. His burned fingers stinging beneath the energy restraints. He looked toward the far side of the chamber, behind a thick wall of reinforced security glass. Leora was sitting alone on a cold metal bench. She was still wrapped in Caleb's oversized, oil-stained work jacket, a thick thermal blanket draped over her small shoulders while two station medics casually checked her vitals. Every time she tried to stand up to speak, a security officer stepped directly into her path, forcing her to remain seated. "I want the primary airlock logs pulled," Caleb spoke up, his voice ringing harsh and clear through the pristine hull. The lead official, Director Vaughn, a narrow-faced bureaucrat with sharp, aristocratic features, frowned down from his floating seat. "You will not dictate procedure here, technician. You are currently suspended pending immediate deportation." "Airlock 07 is a primary life support access point," Caleb stated, ignoring the electrical sting in his wrists as he took a step forward. "Station maintenance codes dictate that every temperature variance, badge ping, and manual override is backed up on a secondary junction recorder located in the service wall. Pull the log. See who locked the door." Lord Malrek's smooth expression flickered for a fraction of a second. Director Vaughn glanced nervously toward Malrek's legal advocate, then cleared his throat. "That internal data is classified under private diplomatic privilege." Caleb let out a short, bitter laugh. "Right. You don't care about what actually happened down there. You just care about who's too expensive to anger." A sharp murmur rippled through the upper seating tiers. "Technician Walker," Director Vaughn warned, his voice turning icy. "You are facing permanent revocation of your interstellar work clearance and immediate transfer to a penal facility for destruction of station property. I suggest you hold your tongue." Through the security glass, Leora saw the guards preparing to drag Caleb toward the lower holding cells. Her amber eyes filled with absolute resolve. She reached beneath the heavy collar of Caleb's work jacket, pulled out a small, flat silver pendant hanging around her neck, and pressed her small thumb firmly into its center core. True galactic power doesn't make a grand, theatrical entrance with flashing lights and roaring engines. It makes a tiny click, and turns off the universe around you. The silver pendant in Leora's hand didn't glow. It didn't shoot plasma arcs across the room or sound an emergency alarm. It simply made a soft, mechanical click, like an ancient key turning in a lock. Instantly, every single digital display screen in the massive administrative review chamber died. The floating anti-gravity seats groaned as their secondary magnetic drives engaged, dropping 3 feet in the air before locking into emergency mechanical safety tracks. The white spotlights overhead shut down, plunging the pristine hall into a eerie, dim shadow. Caleb felt the blue energy restraint field around his wrists flicker, sizzle, and vanish entirely. He rubbed his sore forearms, thoroughly confused. Is the power out? Nobody answered him. Director Vaughn gripped his podium in sheer panic, staring wildly at the dead consoles. What is the meaning of this? Security, restore primary power. The high-tech black surveillance drone that had followed Leora for weeks smoothly descended from the vaulted ceiling. It hovered beside the little girl's shoulder. Its jet-black chassis opened up with a series of tiny, precise metallic clicks, revealing a brilliant, burning golden power core inside. Thud. 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 Every blast door leading into the review chamber sealed shut simultaneously, locked down by an unoverridable hardline command. On the massive, main wall behind the judicial bench, the dead screen suddenly flared back to life. A single, blindingly brilliant white emblem burned through the darkness, a white crown suspended over a field of 3 golden stars. Lord Malrek's face didn't just turn pale, it turned the color of chalk. His knees visibly buckled, his aristocratic posture collapsing into sheer terror. His legal advocate backed away from him as if Malrek had suddenly caught an airborne plague. Leora stepped through the side access door. She was still wearing Caleb's giant, oil-stained maintenance jacket, its sleeves rolled up 5 times so her tiny hands could peek out. Her blue-silver fingers were clasped tightly around the silver pendant. Leora. Director Vaughn stammered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely pronounce the syllables. Lady Leora. Please, step away from the unauthorized communications device. Leora stood tall, her small chin lifted high. It is not unauthorized, she said softly. She looked up at the main screen. Grandmother, she whispered into the dim room. I am done watching. The air in the center of the amphitheater bent. A solid column of blinding, violet-white light erupted from the deck floor, shooting straight up to the ceiling. Inside the light, a figure materialized. She was tall, terrifyingly still, draped in heavy, midnight black ceremonial robes that seemed to swallow the light around her. Her skin possessed the same silver-blue luminescence as Leora's, but her features were hardened by decades of absolute rule, eyes like crushed diamonds, cold, ancient, and capable of commanding star fleets with a subtle nod of her head. Empress Serline Vera. Absolute sovereign of the 7-star dominions. The silence that fell over the chamber was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of 50 high-ranking station officials realizing their lives hung by a microscopic thread. One by one, the arrogant directors, the trade representatives, and the security officers dropped to their knees, slamming their foreheads against the cold deck floor. Director Vaughn nearly broke his nose tripping over his own robes in his haste to bow. Lord Malrek dropped to his knees so hard his kneecaps slammed sickeningly against the floor plates, his body trembling uncontrollably. Caleb Walker remained standing. He stayed standing partly because no one had ever taught him the proper protocol for imperial surrender, and partly because he was too busy making sure Leora was still breathing properly. Empress Serline didn't look at the kneeling directors. She didn't look at the terrified station security team. Her diamond-hard gaze swept across the chamber, paused briefly on the shaking form of Lord Malrek, and then locked squarely onto Caleb Walker. You are Caleb Walker, the Empress stated. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of supernovas, vibrating through the metal deck plates beneath Caleb's work boots. Caleb cleared his dry throat, adjusting his greasy tool belt. Yes, ma'am. Behind him, Director Vaughn let out a tiny, whimpering gasp at the human's complete lack of imperial etiquette. Caleb ignored him entirely. The Empress looked down at Caleb's blistered, burned fingers. She looked at his crooked, plastic station ID badge, the grease stains on his trousers, and then at her granddaughter, who was wrapped securely inside his oversized work jacket. "You opened the airlock," Empress Serline said flatly. "Yes, ma'am." "You possessed no military rank." "None." "You possessed no legal clearance." "Not a shred." "Why?" the Empress asked, her cold eyes searching his face. Caleb looked at the powerful ruler of the known galaxy. He didn't offer a grand speech about justice. He didn't recite galactic human rights charters. Because she was cold, Caleb said simply. Behind the Empress, Leora pressed her hands over her mouth, tears finally spilling over her silver-blue cheeks. Empress Serline turned her head very slowly toward the kneeling officials. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees without the air conditioning moving an inch. "Bring me the primary system logs," the Empress commanded. "Now." When an empire demands the truth, bureaucrats stop making excuses and start praying that the floor opens up and swallows them whole. A low-level station technician with trembling hands rushed to the side console, his fingers flying across the emergency override keys. Within seconds, the central holographic display filled with the raw, uncensored data logs from auxiliary Airlock 07. The numbers don't lie. They never do. 11 hours 2 minutes and 14 seconds, manual lock engaged. 11 hours 2 minutes and 18 seconds, temperature setting overridden, sub-zero cold storage protocol. 11 hours 2 minutes and 40 seconds, emergency system alert cancelled via user account, House Thorne diplomatic privilege. 11 hours 14 minutes and 2 seconds, manual override bypass, maintenance technician number 8841 Walker. The cold, brutal timeline burned bright in the air for every kneeling official to see. It wasn't a routine academic exercise. It was a cold-blooded, calculated act of torture inflicted upon an 11-year-old girl by a cruel bully who knew the system would protect him. Empress Serline read the scrolling data line by line. Her regal face remained an unreadable marble mask, but the air around her radiated a terrifying, crushing pressure. "Who cancelled the emergency life support alert?" she asked softly. The technician at the terminal swallowed hard, his voice squeaking. The authorization key belonged to Lord Malrek of House Thorne, Your Majesty." Malrek lifted his pale face from the deck, his voice high-pitched with pure terror. "Your Majesty. It was a misunderstanding. I had no knowledge her physical biology would react so severely to cold storage. She was an unregistered commoner. She hid her identity." Caleb looked down at Malrek with cold contempt. There it was, the classic bully defense. Not sorry. Not remorseful. Just desperately trying to find a soft place to land. She was 11 years old, the Empress stated. The words were quiet, but they shattered the air like thunder. Malrek flinched as if struck by a physical whip. Empress Serline turned her terrifying gaze toward Director Vaughn. "And you, Director?" When Technician Walker requested the secondary thermal logs to prove the child's endangerment. "Why did you refuse?" Director Vaughn's forehead was pressed so hard against the deck plate his skin was bleeding. "Your Majesty, the formal review had not yet reached the evidentiary phase. A child was dying in a steel box," Empress Serline said, her voice dropping into a register that made the glass walls vibrate. "And your official process had not yet reached the phase where human life was considered convenient." Caleb almost let out a laugh, but the terrifying darkness in the room checked his tongue. The Empress turned back to face Caleb. "Technician Walker." "Yes, ma'am. You deliberately destroyed municipal station infrastructure. You struck a noble student's personal escort. You violated 6 regional security protocols. If I ask you now, would you break those laws again?" Caleb looked at the Empress. He thought about his job. He thought about his unpaid rent back in Oregon, his mother's medical debts, and the very real chance that he would be executed right here on the deck floor if he gave the wrong answer. Then he looked at Leora, who was watching him with wide, hopeful amber eyes. "Faster," Caleb said clearly. "Next time, I'd do it a hell of a lot faster." A few kneeling directors gasped in horror at his audacity. Leora covered her face with both hands, a small, choked laugh escaping her lips amidst her tears. Empress Airline studied Caleb for a long, silent minute. For the first time since she had materialized in the chamber, the cold, diamond-hard edge of her expression softened, just an inch, revealing something resembling profound human respect. He possessed no military title, the Empress proclaimed to the silent room. He claimed no noble house. He had zero knowledge of her imperial bloodline. No reward was offered to him. No protection was guaranteed. Yet, while your laws protected your personal comfort, this human protected a child. She raised her right hand. The golden stars on the main screen flared with blinding intensity. "Hear my decree," Empress Airline commanded. House Thorne is stripped of all sector trade monopolies and advisory privileges, effective immediately. Its assets are frozen pending a full imperial tribunal. Malrek collapsed completely, sobbing silently into the floor plates. Director Vaughn is relieved of his post and placed under immediate arrest for systemic corruption, she continued. Station security will be subjected to a total audit. And every municipal law on this station that permits a child to be ignored because of her name will be burned to ash before the sun sets. The Empress looked down at Leora. Her voice instantly dropping into the tender tone of a grandmother. "You may come out now, my little star." Leora didn't run to her grandmother's side. Instead, she walked straight past the kneeling directors, approached Caleb, and carefully slipped her small, blue-silver hand into his raw, burned fingers. "He gave me his jacket," Leora whispered proudly to her grandmother. Caleb looked down at her, smiling tiredly. "You can keep it, kid. Blue's your color anyway." History books usually lie about moments like this. They say empires change because of grand battles and sweeping political declarations. They rarely mention that sometimes, galactic law gets rewritten over a cheap turkey sandwich. By the next morning, the official imperial decree was broadcast across every public monitor on Deep Space Transit Hub Aion-7 in 24 primary galactic languages. It stated plainly that every child, guest worker, refugee, and unnamed traveler under imperial protection would be treated as a sentient person before they were treated as an administrative problem. The station's crew unofficially dubbed it the Walker Clause. "I am not making a public statement," Caleb told the newly appointed station director 2 hours later as he stood in his quarter, wrapping clean white medical bandages around his burned fingers. "I fix machines. I don't give speeches." "The Empress has formally requested your presence in the central dining hall," the director replied nervously. "One does not decline an imperial request, Mr. Walker." "Fine," Caleb sighed. "But I'm not wearing a suit." When Caleb walked into the central cafeteria at noon, the hall was packed to capacity, but it was entirely silent. The noble students sat at their tables with humbled, lowered heads. Lord Malrek was already gone, stripped of his academic uniform and placed on a transport shuttle bound for an imperial detention moon. The silver-robed instructors stood stiffly against the walls, watching the doors with extreme anxiety. In the far corner, tucked beneath the low-gravity moon fern, sat Leora. She was still wearing Caleb's giant, oil-stained maintenance jacket over her pristine royal robes. Caleb walked over, pulling out his usual chair. "You know that jacket smells like industrial coolant and synthetic bacon grease, right?" Leora looked up, a bright, beautiful smile lighting up her face. "I know. It is extremely comforting." "That is the absolute worst laundry review I've ever received," Caleb chuckled, sitting down across from her. Suddenly, the heavy cafeteria doors slid open. The entire room stood up in unison so fast chairs scraped loudly against the metal deck floor. Empress Caroline walked in alone. She wore a simple, elegant dark tunic, leaving her heavy imperial guard stationed outside in the concourse. Caleb started to stand up out of reflex, but Leora reached across the table and yanked his sleeve. "Stay," she whispered. So Caleb awkwardly sat back down, feeling like a man committing a minor diplomatic offense in broad daylight. Empress Caroline approached their small table. Up close, without the holographic projection. She looked less like an all-powerful sovereign and more like an exhausted grandmother who had spent far too many decades surrounded by sycophants and liars. "Mr. Walker," she said softly. "Caleb is fine, ma'am," he replied respectfully. The Empress looked at him warmly. "I owe you a full explanation, Caleb. Leora was placed on this station without her royal titles because I wanted to see how my galaxy treated someone it believed had zero value. I needed to know if my institutions were rotten." Caleb looked around the quiet room at the ashamed faces of the noble students. "That's a pretty brutal test to put an 11-year-old through, ma'am." Empress Caroline's eyes flickered with genuine, deep regret. "Yes. It was." Silence settled over the table. Caleb reached down into his canvas bag, pulled out his wax paper package, and unwrapped his lunch. He pulled out a plastic knife, neatly sliced his turkey sandwich in half, and pushed one piece across the table toward Leora. Then, after a second's hesitation, he cut his own half into two smaller pieces, picked up one, and pushed it directly toward the Empress of the Seven-Star Dominions. Behind them, 3 royal attendants nearly passed out from sheer horror. Empress Caroline stared down at the wedge of white bread and sliced turkey as if Caleb had placed an unexploded thermal detonator on the table. "Is this a human diplomatic ritual?" Caleb shrugged, taking a bite of his own piece. "Not officially. But where I come from, if you sit down at the table, you eat." Leora let out a bright, ringing laugh. And then, slowly, impossibly, Empress Caroline smiled. She reached out with her long, elegant silver fingers, picked up the small piece of sandwich, and took a small, delicate bite. "It is surprisingly acceptable," the Empress noted, her eyes crinkling with quiet humor. "Though the grain structure is somewhat dense." "Station bread," Caleb agreed solemnly. "It builds character." For the next half hour, the most powerful sovereign in known space sat in a cheap plastic chair in a municipal cafeteria, eating a questionable turkey sandwich beside her hidden granddaughter and a low-level maintenance worker from Oregon. Later, the galactic news feeds would get the story entirely wrong. They would write sweeping, dramatic holodramas about Caleb Walker, portraying him as a fearless human warrior who single-handedly defied an empire out of revolutionary fervor. Caleb knew the truth. He had been terrified the entire time. Terrified of losing his job, terrified of going to prison, terrified of being shipped back home in disgrace. But real courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was just looking across a crowded room, seeing a kid sitting all by herself, and deciding your lunch wasn't too small to share. Before Empress Caroline stood up to depart, she looked at Caleb one final time. "Tell me, Caleb. Why did you help her before you knew who she was?" Caleb looked at Leora, then out at the hall full of people who were finally learning how to look at the quiet corners of the world. "Because," Caleb said gently, "kids shouldn't have to be important before somebody cares about them." And that was the single sentence that traveled farther than any starship fleet. Deeper than any imperial decree, and longer than any royal reign, not because it was powerful, but because it was true.